Welcome to the Inland Valley Storytellers Monthly Story Swap Meeting. My name is John St. Clair, and I am the leader of this group, and I am your Zoom host. And at this point, there are no Zoom participants, but we're going to record this anyway. So who would like to tell the first story? Actually, we'll turn it this way. Person will come here. Okay, Barbara. So
ahead of you, Lynn. Are you ready to raise your hand?
No. I'm ladies first.
So position yourself so you show.
I can see. So my name is Barbara Rugeley, and I've come to share a story with you. I call this story Team Santa. I was about 8 when the neighbor boy told me that there wasn't a Santa. And I just couldn't believe it. The entire world was in conspiracy to keep me from knowing this. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't believe it the whole world could be hiding this from me, from all of us. So I ran over to my grandmother's house and I told her what I just heard. And she said, "That just makes me so mad. I've heard that old canard forever and ever, and it's not true. I'm telling you, it's not true." So I like to go visit Grandma because she always, on the weekends, does cinnamon rolls. And I was in the middle of eating a cinnamon roll, and she said, "Get your coat on, we're going." I said, "But I haven't finished my cinnamon roll. Bring it with you." So we got in the car and we went to Kresge's, just a little store that has a little bit of everything in it, some wooden stairs going up. And she said, "I'm giving you $10 and you need to think of somebody that needs a gift, and then you buy it for them and we'll see what happens." And so I'll be waiting out in the car until you finish. Well, I'd never gone shopping all by myself before. I'd been in Kresge's before, but I'd never had $10 in my pocket before. And I had to think of somebody that needed something. And my cousins were fine. My aunts and uncles were fine. And then I thought of this boy at school named Joe Paul Banks. He never went out at lunchtime or recess, and he always had a note saying that he was had a cold. Well, he didn't have a cold. We all knew he didn't have a cold. He didn't have a coat. That's what he didn't have. So I was going to get Joe Paul a coat. I looked and I found a red parka with hood, and it was a corduroy. I thought he'd like that. So then I went to the counter and I put my $10 down and I put the coat up there, and I told the woman I wanted to buy this coat for my friend Joe Paul Banks. And she said, "This is a gift for someone else?" And he said, "Yes." I told her all about Joe Paul. He was the kind of kid that didn't quite fit in, you know. I don't know what era you come from, but when I was 8 years old, you didn't want to have pants that you roll up and have little flannel underneath. It's all plaid, no. And he wore those kinds of pants, so he wasn't stylish, you know. Plus, he had a double name, Joe Paul. That wasn't popular anymore, even in Oklahoma, where I was raised. So I told her all about Joe Paul, and she said, "Okay." She took my $10 and she didn't give me any change. She put the jacket inside a bag. She put the ticket in with the stuff. I went outside and Grandma was waiting in the car. And so then we went to her house and we wrapped the gift. And there was a tag that fell out of the bag, and she put it in her Bible. So what do we do next, Grandma? She says, "Well, now we go deliver the gift." And Santa, everything has to be silent, secret. So Joe Paul can't know that you're at the front door. We've got to hide. So we drove down the street and we parked like 2 blocks away from his house so he couldn't find us. And then we hid in the bushes outside Joe Paul's house. And then she said, "Okay, take your gift and go up to the door and knock on the door and leave the bag." So I went up there and I was kind of nervous. I put the bag on the ground, I knocked real loud on the door, and I ran away. Joined Grandma where it was safe in the bushes with Grandma. Mm-hmm. And it took a while. I thought maybe he wasn't even home, but sure enough, he came to the door, opened it up, and there was the gift. And he took it and went inside. So we went home, and And Grandma said, now you're part of Team Santa. Now you know that Santa really does exist. And I don't have Grandma anymore, but I've got the Bible. And the Bible was a little tag that said 1995. And that's the story about Team Santa. And may you all have love to share, health to spare, and friends that care. That's my story. Yes, I am. Totally.
Oh, wow. Thank you, Barbara. That was wonderful. Okay. You have a story?
I do.
Do you want to be next?
No. I'll wait for you.
Was thinking about my various Christmas stories. I have quite a few. And there's one that I don't think I've told in several years, mostly because it's a little religious and it might be uncomfortable for some mixed audiences. You can live with it, I'm sure. The legend of St. Bernardo's Wood. In the hills above Cumbria, there lived a simple farmer, an honest and kind man. He lived there, he worked his farm, he worked with his animals, and he lived his life pretty calmly. And that might have been his life, as it had been his grandfather's life, as it had been his great-grandfather's life. But in the fall of a year, he was out looking down the valleys below his pasture land, and he saw someone coming up the path. Well, people went that way from time to time, but this man seemed to be stumbling, barely moving forward. And as he watched, the man literally fell forward onto the ground. Well, being a good human being, he rushed down and helped the man up to his house. And he nursed him back to health, and he stayed there for the whole winter. He turned out to be a friar, a priest, a man named Diego, who was going around to talk about the new religion. Of course, this peasant had worshipped the Roman gods as was required, and as his ancestors had worshipped the Greek gods when that was necessary, and his other ancestors, other gods going back to antiquity. But none of it ever had touched him before. But as he heard these stories, amazement filled him. His mind was opened in ways he couldn't understand, and he began repeating some of the stories back to Diego. And then, when spring came, Diego said, I must go on about my business. I name you Bernardo. Bernardo, teacher. It's up to you to teach others. Newly christened Bernardo truly didn't know how to do that, for he rarely spoke to his neighbors and certainly wasn't someone who would jump out into the world and start preaching. So he just took to telling the stories he had learned to the animals as he worked with them. He would say things like, "Oh, ox, slow and patient, once Jesus met a woman at a well." And as he told these stories to the animals over and over and over again, he began to rearrange them so that they made sort of a continuum of events in the life of Jesus. And this legend he liked best was of the animals at the nativity, at the first manger, where he truly believed that those animals, had talked that night, had seen the Lord born, and had worshipped him as had the people around him. And he wanted to see that miracle. And so he went down to the port of Cambria to ask what it would take for him to travel there. And they said, well, it'll take you 3 pieces of gold to pay for your passage there and back. And you should have 3 pieces to pay for things as you go, and 3 more to offer as a gift to the church. And so Bernardo, who had always worked his land, now worked harder than he had ever worked. He raised more, he took more to places, he raised money, and slowly his coins grew. Finally, he had his ninth piece of gold, and he began to make a plan to go off to the Holy Land to find the place where this had all taken place. It was the night before he was going to leave that fall that he went down and looked out the path that has often had people on it and saw a figure dashing from rock to rock coming toward him. Very small, obviously a child, and no adult anywhere nearby. And as he watched the kid come forward, he realized the child was hurt. When he reached his plateau, Bernardo said, "Please, child, come in and share food. Let me see what I can do for you." He had been badly beaten. He was a slave and had run away from an abusive master. And Bernardo said, "I will tend to you, take care of you. I cannot break the law directly, but if you've run away far enough, maybe you'll be able to stay with me for a while." And so he nursed the child back to health. One evening, though, as he looked down the path from his valley, he saw a Roman soldier approaching. He had the boy hide. And when the Roman soldier got there and asked if he had seen a slave boy, he said, "Why don't you say that all you found was his bones, and I will give you these 9 pieces of gold?" And so he did. And the child became his son. And he learned the stories that his father told. And they worked very, very hard to raise the 9 pieces of gold so that once again Bernardo could plan to leave. The money was acquired. But before they could begin the journey, a whole group of people came up into his plateau. They were wearing Christian symbols. They were coming, following the steps of the good Diego, coming to try and build a church wherever Diego had stayed. And they had heard of the kind gentleman who had nursed him back to health and planned to build a cathedral right there in his plateau. They said, "Can you help us?" And he said, "Of course I can." And he gave to them land. And he took his leather purse with the 9 pieces of gold and put it into the hand of the priest, saying, "This will help us build our church." And his life became wrapped up in that church. And he learned stories that he hadn't been told. And he heard songs that he hadn't heard before. His knowledge grew. His farming skills were needed. The church was built, and he grew old. But he didn't like one of the things that was happening. It seemed like most of the church's preaching were about the crucifixion and the suffering, and the resurrection. And he said, "Of course you must teach these things, but you're missing the joy. You're not teaching about the miracles that happened at Christmas very often at all, just a few days a year. And that should be a part of everything you do." And the more educated, priestly people just sort of ignored him. And as years went on, the younger monks began to talk about it. He is so old. How can he continue to tend to the animals in the gardens the way he does? Surely he must, I just don't know what to do with them. He harms no one. And if he wants to talk about Christmas every weekend, that's it's not harming any of us. And so they sort of ignored this going on in his life. They got to where they hardly looked at him. But it was approaching Christmas, and he was feeling his age. And after matins on Christmas Eve, instead of going back to his pallet to sleep, he went in to the church and looked and thought, why can they not see that there's things they could have done with this? And he went out and he brought in a couple of the sheep, a couple of the goats, and sat them around with him and began to sing what Christmas carols they hadn't sung that night. Midnight Mass came. They came in and they saw the animals peacefully sitting around the front of the church. And Bernardo, perfectly still, with a look of great wonder in his face. They looked at that and they noticed that in his hand was a leather purse. And when they opened that leather purse, there were 9 pieces of gold. And the sacrist said, that is the gift he gave to start our church. And the other people said, it must be a miracle. They talked about that in the next year, and they realized we need to do something to remember this man. So those that had the crafts made wooden animals and figures and a creche, the first creche ever built in a Christian church. So if ever you see a nativity scene, remember that that is there because of a great and very simple man.
Hmm.
Thank you, Ron. Okay, you want to be next?
Sure. Oh, no surprise. I've got a song that's going to accompany my story. This is by Charlie Nguyen, and it's a song titled "Starry Sea," which is somewhat emblematic of this story I'm going to tell. And tonight's story is autobiographical, so it's a true story. And the name of the story is called "The Watcher." And it's a story at Christmas time. I've been thinking, and through Thanksgiving and this holiday season, thinking back of a dear friend of mine who was my, I wouldn't say childhood mentor, but a gentleman that I met in my early 20s. His name was Ray. And Ray not only was a dear friend, but really taught me a lot of life lessons, taught me a lot of ways of being as a young man emerging in the world. And Ray and I worked together at a company in Los Angeles. And I was in sales and marketing, and Ray was in operations. And one of the neat things about Ray, and I used to call him affectionately Captain Ray. That'll make sense to you in a moment. But Captain Ray always would teach a life lesson, but he would illuminate it in a parable, in some type of story. He would share the journeys of his life and his stories, but it was always, as he shared his life stories, it always felt like he was telling a parable. And I wanted to share a little bit of Ray with you guys, and some of the stories that have made such an impact on my life. And Ray was an interesting man because he stood 6 feet 6 inches tall. He was huge, very, very towering figure, and very dynamic personality, very strong personality. And so could be somewhat intimidating, his height, but he had a good heart and a good soul. And oftentimes, as I looked up to him for guidance on how to be, and he would do little things. One I remember, I used to have in my early 20s, I wore a tennis watch, and it wasn't a very professional business watch. And he would look down at you, and he would be very direct with things. And he would say, well, when are you going to get a real adult watch? And so the next day I raced out and got a business watch. Little touches like that. Other times he would help me buy furniture or buy things for the kitchen. He loved to cook. He was a fantastic cook. So these little things, that the life lessons. And one day we were sitting around talking about life and dreams and what we wanted to do when we got older and who we wanted to be. Of course, he was much older than I was, so he had already been. And sometimes he would unpack these small vignettes, these little poems that he would share about a lesson. And one of them was a poem by Nora Zale Hurston, I believe, and it was something to the effect of ships at a distance have every man's wish on board. And for some, they come in with the tide. And for others, they sail forever on the horizon. Sometimes they come in, but mostly, for many, never landing. And then not until the watcher turns his eyes away in resignation, his dreams mocked to death by time, Ray would say, perhaps this is the life of men. And then that little short vignette, it was that we all have dreams, men and women, boys and girls, and that sometimes they do manifest. And so a lot of our conversations were about changing our thinking, looking at all that was possible. So Ray's former life was that of a Navy captain, United States Navy. And he shared a particularly interesting story. At the time, I didn't know whether it was true or false, or if it was a grand tale or what it was. But again, he would unpack these little stories. He was out on the high seas, and Ray was the captain of an aircraft carrier. So he commanded the world's most powerful ship. And a voice came across the radio and said, "You need to change your course by 15 degrees north to avoid a collision." And Ray took that in and commanded his crew to radio back, "You need to change your course 15 degrees south to avoid a collision." So there was an impasse. And a few moments came by, or went by rather. And again, across the radio crackled the voice. "We ask that you, and we implore that you need to change your course by 15 degrees north to avoid a collision." Well, by this time, Ray and his personality, remember, 6'6" and very dynamic, was now getting upset. He, of course, was the captain of an aircraft carrier, the world's most powerful ship. So he got on the radio. He said, "This is Captain Ray Magnuson of the United States Navy. I command the world's most powerful aircraft carrier. And we have an armada of 3 destroyers and many other ships with us. Again, we command you to change your position by 15 degrees south to avoid our collision." And at that, he thought it would be solved. Of course, a few moments would go by. And I'm sure as no surprise, the voice came back. "Captain Magnuson, as you wish. It is your call. This is a Canadian lighthouse." And in that lesson, I didn't find out whether that was true or false years later, was a very valuable lesson about changing our path in life, taking in the opinion of others. Perhaps we set sail on a certain journey and a course. And are we willing to take in the opinion of others and change our path, change and alter our course, perhaps to our benefit instead of our detriment? So again, his stories always had this electrifying sense of drama to them. And Ray loved when he wasn't, later on in our life together as friends and him as my mentor, we actually owned a boat together in the Long Beach harbor. And so Ray had traded his aircraft carrier for a 27-foot sailboat. And I would be up at the front doing my best John F. K. impersonation, and he'd be at the helm. And we would have our friends and girlfriends, and he was married, so he had his wife, and it was an amazing time in my young life to be on that sailboat. But when he wasn't on the sailboat, Captain Ray's favorite pastime was baseball. We have a baseball fan in here, a couple baseball fans. This one took me years to figure out, but Ray's favorite saying to me, and he would always say it, he would do his thing, he would say, you know, Glenn, a 289 hitter is a 289 hitter. And I used to wonder, what did he mean by that? And he would say it for years, month after month. And I didn't want to ask him, well, what does that really mean? I kind of just, okay, yeah, a 289 hitter is a 289 hitter. Until one day I did some research and I looked it up. Turns out, you may know this as a baseball fan, that in life, when you're at bat and you're getting that pitch, you choose not to swing, and you take that first strike, and you don't take any action. Well, now you have one strike. As you baseball people know, you have 3 strikes and you're out. You take the second pitch, and now it's 0-2, and you have 2 strikes against you. Turns out the statistical odds are you will hit 289. The ironic thing is, as we all know of baseball, a 300, a 325, a 350 hitter is an all-star, is somebody paid a lot of money. But in baseball, a 289 hitter is considered a failure. So the analogy, as I've learned the pattern of our conversations and his mentorship over the years, was that every time we were talking about somebody perhaps falling short, maybe they hadn't seized the moment. Maybe their way of being was not as good as it should have been, or their error in judgment. Ray would hear it, and he'd say, you know, Glenn, 289 hitter is a 289 hitter. And so again, these little vignettes of lessons that would be illuminated and imparted to me. And one of the last times I ever saw my dear friend and mentor and ever spoke with him, he lived in San Diego and he was on his way to Pasadena for a meeting. And as shortly after that, he would make his pilgrimage out to Arizona. He loved spring training. That was his 2 days, 3 days, 4 days of spring training was his Shangri-La. He loved that. He'd always be out there, and he had season tickets to Dodger games. And one of the highlights of my life was my friendship with an LA Dodger. And I brought the LA Dodger over to Ray's house, surprising him. We were down in San Diego watching the San Diego Padres. And Ray didn't know it, but I brought my friend who played for the LA Dodgers over to Ray's house. It was one of the greatest gifts I ever brought my friend and mentor. And so I just wanted to share a couple of brief life lessons with all of you that he would share with me. And I have never forgotten just those little stories and those parables that would give us a life lesson. And that is the story of the Watcher.
Thank you, Glenn. John. So, who was the LA Dodger player?
Adrian Beltre. So when I got married, my wife was best friends with his wife, which at the time was his fiance, and then they got married. So we had a friendship that lasted several years.
All right, very good. Okay, I have a story. Do you have a story tonight, Chris? Probably doesn't. Do you want to tell a story, or you just want to be a listener tonight?
Well, I just kind of wandered in here.
Yeah.
But I can tell a very short story.
If you want to, you're
Okay,
welcome to.
Sure.
I'll close it.
So yeah, I tell you, I wasn't prepared for this, but
Well, this is great. It's good
yeah.
for us.
So I guess both are true stories because they happened, and I well, when I say both, I thought, okay, let me tell 2 stories because the theme seems to be Christmas and something that changed your life. So they're both very short. Both have to do with my daughter, who's now 40 in her next birthday. But the first one, Christmas story was when she was 6 or 7. Her mother decided that she can't be living and perpetuating a lie. So she said, "I'm going to tell her that there is no Santa Claus." I said, "You really don't need to do that." But I have no idea exactly why she wanted to so much tell her 6-year-old that there was no Santa Claus, but she did. And so my daughter Ayesha came to me and said, "Dad, what do you think?" And I said, "Well, I'm a scientist and I believe there is a Santa Claus because I've seen things that happen. But, it's something that I think you'll have to just figure out for yourself." Because I didn't want to say, "No, your mom's wrong." I mean, I couldn't without, just demeaning her and causing confusion in the 6-year-old. She suddenly said, "Dad, I know what we could do. Why don't we leave a glass of milk and cookies on the table in the living room? And if it's gone tomorrow, we know that there is a Santa Claus and if it's still there, it doesn't exist." And so she poured out a glass of milk. She got some cookies and she put it in a plate and she kind of came down a couple of times to make sure it was there. She went to sleep. Next morning, the cookies and milk were gone. She said, "Dad, there is a Santa Claus." That was that. It was not until 2, 3, or 4 years later that she again started wondering.
Yeah.
The second story also involves her. When she was 4, both her sets of grandparents, one from India and one from Chicago, had come to celebrate her birthday. We lived in Lexington, Kentucky. And she had such a good time that a couple of days after her birthday, and I'd just joined as an assistant professor at the University of Kentucky. I'd been teaching a couple of years. I was getting my, feet wet, just being a new teacher and figuring out how to teach a class of 200 students introductory astronomy, because it was a very popular subject and students would take it thinking, "Oh, this is I like looking at the stars, so we take astronomy," and not realizing that it's actually physics and there's a lot to it. But so we had just settled in Lexington when she was 2, and this was her, 3rd birthday party there. The neighborhood kids had come. It was so fun that a couple of days later she said, "Dad, can I have another birthday party?" And I said, "Well, birthdays only come once a year. Do you know what a year is?" And I was now really kind of testing this 4-year-old. And she said, "Do you know how many days, how many months there are in a year?" She was kind of still. I said, "You can have a half birthday party. How about that? You'll have to wait a little less." "What's that?" I said, "Well, a year is divided into 12 months. And we could have a birthday party sort of midway." So she said, "Well, when would that be?" And like any aspiring parent, I thought, well, let me see if she can figure this out. Being, again, a science and math teacher. So I said, "Well, there are 12 months in a year. What's half of 12? She got really serious in the face. She was quiet for almost a minute or 2 minutes, and she suddenly brightened up and said, "12." And I had to admit she was right.
Yeah.
But the reason I remember this so much is it changed my whole philosophy about teaching because I was the expert there, the astrophysicist telling these 200 students how things were and whether, and kind of spewing out knowledge. And I had to admit that my daughter had come up with an answer. What's half of 12 that I'd always believed was 6, which was completely valid. And maybe it was the compassion we have for our children. But the next day, when I walked into the classroom, I was changed. I had compassion for my students, and I thought they have a lot to teach me. And ever since then, that one incident has really defined me as a teacher, as someone who's not just there to spew out what they know or knowledge, but to learn mutually from their students.
All right. Maybe you can teach me real quick because math is my worst subject. What is what?
What?
Half
of
of
12.
Is that
Well,
TWE.
half of 12 is 12.
It's looking
I
at
thought
it.
it was a fancy algebra thing.
No, it was not math. It was,
Okay.
She figured out what was half of 12.
it was a linguistic half.
I'm sorry, that flew right over.
I'm glad you got the clarification. I was never gonna get that straight. I
I
hope you
wasn't-
come back next month.
I wasn't the sharpest tool tonight in school shit.
Well, so I have a folk tale to tell, which I often do. I almost just told the story about when the anthropologist came to our meeting and we did the museum display at San Bernardino State College because I've been cleaning up and I found the display. Did you save yours?
No.
I save everything. So, but I decided against it, and I'm going to do a folk tale. Usually, oops, I'm not in the screen. Usually, I tell folk tales from Europe or Asia, sometimes Africa, but usually Europe or Asia. But this one's a folk tale from the United States, and it's called "The Doll That Caught a Thief." Long time ago in this country, there were taverns spread out across the countryside, so a traveler could count on having a place to stay on a long journey that would take multiple days. They come across the tavern and spend the night and have a meal there in the evening, in the morning, and then take off the next day, and they come to another tavern. Well, on a particular night at a particular tavern, everybody had something valuable stolen. Now, this tavern owner was very careful because there are vagabonds out, traveling. And so he was very careful to lock every window and bolt every door before he went to bed at night. And when everybody got up the next morning, they discovered they were missing many things. And so they gathered together and they were all clamoring, and everybody was there that was there at night. No one had left. And of course, the tavern owner was very adamant that they had to find these valuables, find the thief, because if word got out that it wasn't safe to stay at his tavern, he was ruined. And so he gathered them all together and they split up in pairs and they searched the whole tavern to see if they could find. Mostly it was gold coins. And they figured adding all up, it was like $3,000 worth. And besides gold coins, a couple people had gold watches. One person had an heirloom snuff box that had been in the family for many years, and he swore he wouldn't sell it for less than $100. But they couldn't find anything. And so they were gathered in this big room, and an old woman said, "I can find the thief." And everybody turned and looked at her in disbelief. How are you going to find the thief? And she said, "I'm going to go into the back room and I'll be right back." Well, she went into the back room. She took out a wooden doll, set it on the table, and she covered it with walnut juice. And then she came back into the room and she said, I have a magic doll that can tell when people are lying. And she looked right at the owner and she said, each one of us, one at a time, will go into that back room and grab hold of the doll and say, I did not steal anything. And if they're telling the truth, nothing will happen. But if they're lying, the doll will start screaming and yelling, and we'll know who the thief is. And, you know, everybody was kind of suspicious. I mean, it sounded kind of ridiculous, but they decided to humor her, and one at a time, including her and the tavern owner, went in, came out, there was no sound. And so she said, did you all grab hold of the doll and tell it that you did not steal anything? And they all said they did it. And then she said, okay, line up. Everybody line up and hold out your hands, palm up. And so she went along and she came to the man who said he had a snuff box stolen. He said, this is the thief. And of course he denied it, but she said, I'm positive this is the thief. And so someone got a rope and they were going to hang him. And especially the owner was so furious, he wanted to hang him then and there. But the other people wanted their valuables back. And the man said, okay, I did steal it, but you don't want to hang me because I hid it so well you'll never find your valuables. If you want your stuff back, promise to me you'll let me go and I'll tell you where your valuables are. So they talked a little bit and decided, okay, we agree. And they all swore on a Bible that if he told them where their valuables were and they got all their stuff back, they would let him go. And so he said, there's an old stove in the back of the tavern and there's a wood pile. At the bottom of the wood pile, there is a hollow log. I hid it all in the hollow log. And so everybody went running back, and sure enough, they took that took the log out and shook it, and all these gold coins and the gold watches came tumbling out, and they all got their stuff back. And then they said, okay, take off. And they gave him a head start, but really none of them really wanted to follow him. They were happy. They got all their things back. And so then they decided to have a little fun. When he had admitted he had stolen, they took his gold watch off, and they decided to raffle it off as a kind of a celebration. And the man who won the raffle and got the thief's gold watch, he took the watch over and he handed it to the woman and said, thank you for getting our valuables back and catching that thief. And then someone else said, here's my hat. Let's pass it around if you want to put in a coin or two to thank this woman. And they passed it around. Sure enough, everybody put in a coin or two. And then the owner said, we are so thankful that you did this for us. You can have what's in that hat if you'll tell us, how did you know who the thief was? And she said, well, I covered that wooden doll with walnut juice. And everybody that picked it up had their hands stained. So when you're an honest person, you went and did it. But the thief thought there was some trick. Somehow this magic doll would give him away. So he did not pick up the doll. So he was the only one that did not have walnut stains on his hands. And that's how I knew he was the thief. And so they all thanked her very much. And she took her doll and put it back in her bag and went on her way. Okay,
How did you get that story?
well,
Do you remember?
yeah.
Sorry.
Where I get most stories from Dan Ketty.
There's the book.
Elder Tales, tales of wisdom from all over the world. In fact, this was right next to the story I told last month, the story bag, the one
The
from
celebration
Korea.
last month.
At our meeting here
Oh,
last
okay.
month. Yeah. So I get a lot of stories from here. So I think we're done with the stories. I want to show something. The camera. Let's see if this is going to show. Anyway, this is the financial statement for the group. So we're getting it recorded. We're
Including keeping us financially solvent.
I'm going to take one and pass. Sure. I'm going to stop the recording. Let's see, where is it? Here it is.
Well, I don't remember that one.